Chapter 1. The Hook. The newsroom at the New York Post buzzed with its usual chaos of ringing phones and clacking typewriters, but Vincent Torino barely heard it. He sat hunched over his desk, the same position he'd held for the past 6 hours, staring at crime scene photos that told stories most people couldn't stomach with their morning coffee. Blood spatter patterns, entry wounds, the kind of details that separated real crime reporting from the sanitized television version. "Torino," Eddie Marconi's voice cut through the newsroom din. The editor's heavy Brooklyn accent always got thicker when deadline pressure mounted. "You got that Castellano follow-up ready?" Vinny glanced at his watch. 4:47 p.m. The evening edition would hit the streets in 2 hours, and his article on the aftermath of Paul Castellano's assassination was still 3 paragraphs short. He'd been chasing sources all week, trying to piece together the power shift that followed Big Paul's execution outside Sparks' Steakhouse. "Almost there, Eddie." Vinny lit another Marlboro, his 4th in the past hour. The ashtray overflowed with evidence of his stress. "Just waiting on confirmation from my guy in the DA's office." "Well, wait faster. Channel 7 wants you for the 5 o'clock. Something about the Gotti angle." Television appearances weren't Vinny's favorite part of the job, but they came with the territory. In 1987, crime reporters who could speak in sound bites found themselves in high demand. The public couldn't get enough of mob stories, especially anything involving John Gotti, the flashy Don who'd seized control of the Gambino family after ordering Castellano's hit. Vinny stubbed out his cigarette and grabbed his jacket. March in New York still carried winter's bite, and the Channel 7 studio was only 4 blocks away. He'd done this walk dozens of times, past the hot dog vendors and newspaper stands where his own bylines stared back at him from the front page. The studio's green room smelled like burnt coffee and hairspray. Vinny straightened his tie and checked his reflection in the mirror. 54 years old, gray creeping in at the temples, lines around his eyes that hadn't been there when he started this beat. 8 years of covering the 5 families had aged him in dog years. "Mr. Torino?" A young production assistant with a clipboard appeared at his elbow. "We're ready for you." The lights always felt hotter than they should. Vinny settled into the guest chair across from anchor Janet Morrison, a blonde woman in her 30s who'd made her reputation covering political scandals but occasionally dabbled in crime stories when ratings demanded it. "We're live in 30 seconds, the floor director announced. Janet shuffled her notes. "We'll start with the Castellano angle, then transition to what this means for Gotti's position." "Standard stuff," Vinny nodded. He'd done variations of this interview at least 20 times since the Christmas Eve murder. The same questions, the same answers, the same speculation about mob succession and territorial wars. The red light blinked on. "Good evening. I'm Janet Morrison, and joining me now is Vincent Torino, crime reporter for the New York Post and one of the city's foremost experts on organized crime. Vince, it's been 3 months since Paul Castellano's assassination. What's your assessment of John Gotti's consolidation of power?" Vinny slipped into interview mode, the practiced rhythm of television patter. He explained the power vacuum, the internal family politics, the likely targets for retaliation. Standard analysis delivered in television-friendly segments. "Now Gotti's had his share of personal tragedies," Janet continued, reading from her teleprompter. "The loss of his son Frank in that accident last year. How has that affected his leadership style?" This was where Vinny should have stuck to the script, should have offered some generic observation about grief and decision-making. Instead, something darker surfaced, a cynicism born from 8 years of watching these men destroy everything they touched. "Well, Janet, let's be honest here." Vinny leaned forward slightly, that familiar edge creeping into his voice. "Frank Gotti was 12 years old, riding a mini-bike, and got hit by a car. Tragic? Sure, but let's not pretend the Teflon Don's parenting skills were ever going to win any awards. Kid probably had a better chance with foster care." The words hung in the studio air like cigarette smoke. Janet's smile flickered for just a moment, the kind of micro-expression that separated live television from print journalism. "You couldn't take back what you just said to 2 million viewers. That's..." "Certainly one perspective," Janet managed, already steering toward commercial break. Vinny smiled at camera too. the same professional expression he'd worn for dozens of these appearances. "That's what you get with me, Janet." Perspective without the sugar coating. The red light died. Commercial break. Walking back to the post, Vinny felt the familiar satisfaction of a job completed. Another appearance, another opportunity to build his reputation as the reporter who told uncomfortable truths about uncomfortable people. He'd said worse things about worse people, and never lost sleep over it. His daughter Sarah would be home from school by now, probably working on homework at the kitchen table while listening to Madonna on her Walkman. Normal teenage stuff in a normal family life that existed in careful separation from his professional world. 72 hours later, that separation would prove to be an illusion. Chapter 2, Introduction. The smell of marinara sauce and garlic hit Vinny as soon as he turned his key in the lock of the Bay Ridge apartment. Home. After 8 hours of crime scenes and camera lights, the simple domesticity of Sarah cooking dinner felt like stepping into a different universe, one where the worst thing that happened was burning the pasta. "Dad?" Sarah's voice carried from the kitchen, accompanied by the sizzle of onions and olive oil. "How'd the TV thing go?" Vinny hung his coat on the hook by the door, the same spot where his father had hung his transit authority jacket for 37 years before retirement. The apartment had been in the Torino family since 1962, a modest 2-bedroom with water stains on the ceiling and radiators that clanged like ghosts in the walls. But it was theirs, and after Marie died, it had become the anchor that kept both him and Sarah from drifting apart. "Same as always," he called back, loosening his tie. "Talked about Gotti, talked about dead wise guys, the usual song and dance." Sarah appeared in the doorway, 17 years old with her mother's dark eyes and her father's stubborn chin. She wore a St. Patrick's Academy uniform skirt and an oversized sweater, her long hair pulled back with the kind of scrunchie that seemed to multiply around the apartment like rabbits. Sometimes Vinny looked at her and saw Marie so clearly it took his breath away. "Mrs. Kowalski from 4 Billion says she saw you on Channel 7 last week," Sarah said, stirring the sauce. "She thinks you're famous." "Mrs. Kowalski thinks the mailman's famous because she saw him on the stairs twice in one day." Vinny walked into the kitchen and peered over Sarah's shoulder at the stove. "This smells incredible. Since when do you cook?" "Since you've been living on Chinese takeout and cigarettes for the past month." Sarah bumped him away from the stove with her hip. "Sit. Tell me about your day. The normal parts, not the scary ones." Vinny settled at the kitchen table, the same Formica surface where he'd eaten breakfast as a kid, where he'd helped Sarah with homework for the past 3 years, where Marie used to spread out her nursing school textbooks before the cancer took her energy away. The normalcy of it hit him like a physical thing, the weight of routine, of responsibility, of having someone who cared whether he came home at night. This was what he protected, not just Sarah, but this life they'd built together in the ruins of their grief. The quiet dinners, the homework sessions, the Saturday mornings when she'd steal his newspaper before he could read it, all of it existing in careful quarantine from the violence he documented for a living. "Eddie wants me to follow up on the Castellano story," Vinny said, accepting the plate Sarah set in front of him. "Apparently there's talk of a power shift in Queens." "Do you ever think about covering something else?" Sarah asked, settling across from him with her own dinner. "I mean, sports or politics or something where people don't get shot?" It was a conversation they'd had before, usually after particularly brutal weeks when Vinny came home looking like he'd seen too much. He'd started covering organized crime in 1979, back when Sarah was 9 and Marie was still alive to worry about him. Back then, it had felt like important work, shining light into dark corners, holding dangerous men accountable. Now, sometimes it just felt like voyeurism with a byline. "Sports reporters don't get invited on television," he said, twirling pasta around his fork. "Besides, somebody has to tell these stories. Might as well be someone who knows the difference between a capo and a consigliere." Sarah rolled her eyes. "Dad, you realize most people don't need to know the difference, right? Most people just want to read about the Yankees." She had a point. But Vinny had built his reputation on being the reporter who went deeper, who understood the intricate politics of the 5 families like an anthropologist studying tribal customs. It was work that mattered, even when it left him staring at crime scene photos until his eyes burned. "How was school?" he asked, changing the subject. Jennifer Morrison thinks she's going to get into Columbia early admission. Sarah made a face. She's been talking about it all week like it's already decided. And what about you? Still thinking about journalism? The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications neither wanted to address directly. Sarah had been talking about following in his footsteps since she was 14, but lately Vinny found himself hoping she'd choose something safer, something that wouldn't require her to develop calluses on her conscience. Maybe, Sarah said, not quite meeting his eyes. Or maybe law, help people instead of just writing about them after they're dead. Outside, Bay Ridge settled into its evening rhythm. Kids playing stickball in the street, elderly Italian women watching from fire escapes, the distant rumble of the R train carrying commuters back to their own quiet lives. Normal sounds in a normal neighborhood where the most exciting crime was teenagers drinking beer in Owl's Head Park. Vinny reached across the table and squeezed his daughter's hand, feeling the calluses she'd developed from her part-time job at the library. This was everything that mattered, everything worth protecting. He had no way of knowing that 3 tables over, at Gino's restaurant, someone was making a phone call about the reporter who didn't know when to shut his mouth. Chapter 3, Inciting Incident. The phone rang at 11:47 p.m., jarring Vinny from the uneasy sleep that had become his norm. He'd been dreaming about his brother Tommy again, the same nightmare that visited him most nights, where 15-year-old Tommy was asking for help that never came. The shrill ring cut through the dream like a blade. Vinny fumbled for the receiver in the dark, his reporter's instincts kicking in even before he was fully awake. Late-night calls meant breaking news, emergency sources, or someone who'd finally decided to talk after years of silence. Torino, breathing, heavy, deliberate breathing that made the hair on his neck stand up. Vincent Torino? The voice was gravelly, older, with the kind of Brooklyn accent that had been sandpapered by decades of cigarettes and hard living. Yeah, this is Torino. Who's this? You don't remember me, but I remember you real good. A pause, long enough for Vinny to hear traffic in the background, the distant sound of music from a bar or restaurant. I've been reading your stories for a long time. Real entertaining stuff. Vinny sat up, suddenly wide awake. 8 years on the crime beat had taught him to recognize the difference between crank calls and genuine threats. This voice carried weight, the kind of quiet menace that professionals cultivated. Look, if you've got a story to tell, call me at the office. It's late and... You made a joke on TV, the voice cut him off, about John Gotti's boy, about how the kid would have been better off in foster care. The words hit Vinny like ice water. 3 days had passed since the Channel 7 interview, and he'd almost forgotten the offhand comment about Frank Gotti. Almost. That was just television talk, Vinny said, reaching for the cigarettes on his nightstand. Nothing personal. Nothing personal? The caller's laugh was dry as autumn leaves. Let me tell you something about personal, Mr. Vincent Torino of 84,775th Street, apartment 3B. You got a daughter, Sarah, pretty girl, goes to St. Patrick's Academy. Vinny's blood turned to ice. His hands shook as he lit the cigarette, the flame casting dancing shadows on the bedroom wall. What did you say? Smart kid, too. Works part-time at the Bay Ridge Library. Takes the R train to school every morning, gets off at 59th Street. Walks 2 blocks down 5th Avenue. Listen to me, you piece of... No, you listen. The voice turned harder, each word dropping like stones into still water. You think you can sit in your little studio and make jokes about dead children? You think there's no price for that kind of disrespect? Vinny was fully awake now, adrenaline flooding his system. He reached for the notepad he kept beside the bed, his reporter's training kicking in even as fear clawed at his chest. Who is this? What do you want? I want you to remember something, Vincent. Every story you write, every joke you make on TV, it all has consequences. Sometimes those consequences take a while to come home, but they always come home. The line went dead. Vinny stared at the receiver for a long moment before hanging up. His hands were shaking badly enough that he had trouble getting the cigarette to his lips. He glanced at the clock, 11:51 p.m. 4 minutes that had changed everything. He padded down the hallway in his bare feet, stopping at Sarah's bedroom door. It was slightly ajar, the way she'd left it since she was small and afraid of the dark. He could hear her breathing, see the gentle rise and fall of her blankets in the dim light from the street lamp outside. She was safe. She was home. The caller was probably just some crank who'd gotten lucky with publicly available information. Address records were easy enough to find, and Sarah's school wasn't exactly a state secret. But as Vinny stood in that doorway, watching his daughter sleep, he felt something fundamental shift inside him. For 8 years he'd operated under the assumption that his work stayed at work, that the violence he documented existed in a separate universe from the life he'd built with Sarah. The voice on the phone had just shattered that illusion. He walked back to his room and sat on the edge of the bed, smoking in the dark. Outside, Bay Ridge slept its peaceful sleep, oblivious to the fact that something had just changed in apartment 3B. The normal sounds of the neighborhood, distant sirens, the hum of late-night traffic, now carried different weight. Vinny thought about the joke he'd made on Channel 7, the casual cruelty of it. Frank Gotti had been 12 years old when that car hit him. Just a kid on a mini-bike, like thousands of other kids in thousands of other neighborhoods. But Vinny had turned his death into a punchline, another bit of television patter designed to showcase his insider knowledge and tough guy persona. Now someone was calling in that debt. The reporter in him wanted to dismiss it as an empty threat, the kind of intimidation tactic he'd encountered dozens of times over the years. But the father in him, the man who'd already lost his brother to the streets, couldn't take that chance. Everything had changed with that phone call. There was no going back to the comfortable separation between Vincent Torino, the crime reporter, and Vinny, the single father from Bay Ridge. The past had just knocked on his door. Vinny didn't sleep the rest of the night. He sat at the kitchen table, chain-smoking Marlboros and staring at the phone, willing it to ring again so he could demand answers. But the silence stretched on, broken only by the occasional rumble of late-night traffic on 4th Avenue and the steady tick of the wall clock Marie had bought at a church bazaar 10 years ago. By dawn, he'd almost convinced himself it was nothing, just another crank caller who'd gotten lucky with some basic information. Hell, the phone book listed his address, and any idiot could figure out where Sarah went to school by hanging around the neighborhood for an afternoon. Sarah emerged from her bedroom at 7, already dressed in her uniform, backpack slung over her shoulder. She moved through her morning routine with the efficiency of someone who'd been getting herself ready for school since she was 14. Coffee, toast, a quick check of her homework. "You're up early," she said, noticing the overflowing ashtray and the dark circles under his eyes. "Couldn't sleep. Work stuff." Vinny stubbed out his cigarette and tried to look casual. "Hey, maybe I should drive you to school today." Sarah paused, butter knife halfway to her toast. "Drive me? Dad, you haven't driven me to school since freshman year. Just thought it might be nice. Father-daughter time." She gave him the look, the same skeptical expression Marie used to deploy when he came home with weak explanations for why he was 3 hours late. "What's going on?" "Nothing's going on. Can't a father want to spend time with his daughter?" "Not when that father is you and it's a Tuesday morning." Sarah sat down across from him, her dark eyes searching his face. "Did something happen? Is this about one of your stories?" The question hit too close to home. Vinny forced a smile and shook his head. "Just feeling protective, I guess. You're growing up too fast." Sarah rolled her eyes, but her expression softened. "I'm 17, Dad. I can handle the subway." She grabbed her backpack and headed for the door, stopping to kiss his cheek on the way out. "See you tonight. Try to get some sleep." The apartment felt enormous after she left. Vinny stood at the window, watching Sarah walk down 75th Street toward the subway station. She moved with the confident stride of someone who'd never had to look over her shoulder, never had to calculate which streets were safe and which ones weren't. The innocence of it made his chest tight. At the office, Vinny tried to fall back into his normal routine, but everything felt different. Eddie Kowalski was holding court by the coffee machine, telling the same stories about his glory days covering City Hall that he'd been telling for 15 years. The newsroom buzzed with its usual energy. Phones ringing, keyboards clacking, reporters chasing down leads for the afternoon edition. "Torino," Eddie's voice boomed across the room. "Perfect timing. I need you to follow up on that Queens thing. Word is there's movement in the Lucchese family." Vinny nodded absently. but his mind was elsewhere. He found himself studying faces differently, wondering if the guy reading the daily news by the elevator had been watching him, if the woman at the newsstand on the corner was really just selling papers, or if she was keeping track of his movements. Paranoia. That's all it was. 8 years of covering organized crime had finally caught up with him, making him see threats where none existed. But when he called his old source in Queens, Paulie Marconi, a low-level bookie who'd been feeding him information for 3 years, the response was different. "Vinny? Jesus, I can't talk to you right now." "What do you mean you can't talk? It's just the usual stuff." Who's moving up? Who's moving out? A long pause. Traffic sounds in the background. Paulie was calling from a payphone, which meant he was already spooked about something. "Look, I heard some things. About you, about that TV interview." Paulie's voice was barely above a whisper. "Word is you stepped in something deep." "What kind of word? From who?" "I can't say. But if I was you, I'd lay low for a while. Maybe take a vacation. Florida's nice this time of year." The line went dead. Vinny stared at the receiver, feeling that familiar ice-cold sensation in his stomach. Paulie Marconi had never hung up on him, never refused to talk. The man lived for gossip, treated information like currency. For him to cut off contact meant something serious was happening. The rest of the day passed in a haze of unanswered phone calls and dead ends. Sources who usually returned his calls within an hour suddenly weren't available. The bartender at Gino's restaurant, a place where half the neighborhood's business was conducted over red sauce and Chianti, claimed he'd never heard of him when Vinny stopped by. By evening, the message was clear. Vincent Torino had become radioactive. He was walking home from the subway when he noticed the car. A black Cadillac Eldorado, maybe 5 years old, parked across from the newsstand where Vinny bought his morning coffee. The engine was running, exhaust visible in the October chill, but nobody got out, nobody got in. It just sat there, dark windows reflecting the streetlights like dead eyes. Vinny had noticed it because he'd been noticing everything since the phone call. Every face that appeared twice, every car that seemed to follow the same route, every shadow that lingered too long. The Cadillac had been outside the post building when he left work. Now here it was, 3 blocks from his apartment. He crossed the street casually, stopping to light a cigarette and steal glances at the car. The windows were too dark to see inside, but he caught the silhouette of at least 2 figures in the front seat. Professional watchers. The kind of men who got paid to sit in cars and take notes about who went where and when. His hands shook as he lit the Marlboro. Not from fear, at least not entirely from fear, but from something deeper. Recognition. Because standing on that corner, feeling eyes on him from the darkness, Vinny was suddenly 15 years old again, watching his brother Tommy disappear into the same kind of car 3 months before they found his body in Prospect Park, with a needle still hanging from his arm. The memory hit him like a physical blow. Tommy, skinny and desperate, owing money to people who collected debts in blood. Vinny had been the one with connections then, the young reporter building sources in the organized crime community. He could have made calls, could have asked for favors, could have found a way to buy his brother time. Instead, he'd chosen his career, told himself he couldn't compromise his journalistic integrity by getting personally involved. Watched Tommy spiral down while he built his reputation writing about other people's tragedies. The Cadillac's engine revved once, then went quiet. A message, maybe, or just a coincidence. But Vinny knew better than to believe in coincidences when men in expensive cars started paying attention to your daily routine. He walked the remaining 2 blocks to his building, forcing himself not to look back. The smart thing would be to call the police, but what would he tell them? That someone had made a vague threat and now cars were parked on public streets? He'd covered enough crime to know how that conversation would go. Mrs. Kowalski was checking her mailbox in the lobby, her gray hair wrapped in the same flowered scarf she'd been wearing since the Carter administration. She looked up when Vinny entered, her face brightening with a kind of enthusiasm that meant trouble. "Vincent, I saw you on the television again last week. Such an important job you have." "Thanks, Mrs. Kowalski." Vinny tried to move toward the stairs, but she stepped into his path. "My nephew Anthony, he works for the sanitation department. He says you know all about the gangsters. The real ones, not like in the movies." The word gangsters hung in the air between them, suddenly loaded with new meaning. Vinny found himself studying Mrs. Kowalski's face, looking for signs that this wasn't just casual conversation, but her eyes held only the gentle nosiness of a woman who'd lived in the same apartment for 40 years and treated neighborhood gossip like a sacred duty. "Just doing my job," Vinny said, edging toward the stairs. "Such dangerous work, though. You should be careful." Mrs. Kowalski's voice carried genuine concern. "These are not nice people you write about." The comment followed him up 3 flights of stairs, echoing in the narrow stairwell. Not nice people. As if the problem was simply a matter of rudeness, of social etiquette gone wrong. But Mrs. Kowalski was right in ways she couldn't understand. These weren't nice people, and Vinny had spent 8 years treating them like characters in a story instead of predators who consumed everything they touched. His apartment felt different when he unlocked the door. Not ransacked or disturbed, but somehow violated. The air carried a weight it hadn't possessed that morning, as if invisible hands had moved through his life, cataloging his possessions, his routines, his vulnerabilities. Sarah's backpack was on the kitchen table, her homework spread out in the methodical way she'd inherited from her mother. She looked up when he entered, pencil poised over what looked like a history assignment. "You look terrible," she said without preamble. "Worse than this morning." Vinny wanted to lie, to offer some easy explanation about deadline pressure or office politics. But looking at his daughter, really looking at her, seeing Marie's determination in the set of her jaw and his own stubborn curiosity in her dark eyes, he felt the weight of every choice that had brought him to this moment. "Sarah," he said, pulling out a chair beside her, "we need to talk." Sarah set down her pencil, the small click echoing in the sudden silence. "This is about the phone call last night, isn't it?" Vinny felt the world tilt sideways. "What phone call?" "I heard you get up. Heard you talking to someone." Sarah's voice was steady, but her hands had moved to her lap, fingers twisted together in a gesture Vinny recognized from her childhood when she'd broken something valuable and was working up the courage to confess. "Then you stood in my doorway for like 10 minutes. You think I don't know when you're watching me sleep?" The careful speech Vinny had prepared, the gentle explanation about taking precautions, about maybe staying with her aunt in New Jersey for a few weeks, crumbled in his throat. "Sarah, I need you to tell me exactly what you heard. Just your voice at first, then you got upset about something." She pulled her history textbook closer, using it like a shield. "Dad, you've been acting weird for 3 days. Ever since that TV interview." 3 days? The words came out sharper than he'd intended. "What do you mean, 3 days?" Sarah's face changed, the teenage certainty flickering into something that looked almost like fear. "The interview was Thursday. It's Tuesday now. 3 days of you checking the locks twice before bed, looking out the window every time a car honks, jumping when the phone rings." Vinny stared at his daughter, really seeing her for the first time in months. Not the kid he still pictured in his mind, pigtails and scraped knees and questions about why mommy had to go to heaven, but a 17-year-old woman who'd been watching him unravel and saying nothing. "How long have you known?" he asked quietly. "Known what?" "That my work brings danger home." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing the edge of her textbook. When she finally spoke, her voice was smaller than he'd heard it in years. "Remember when I was 14 and asked why we never went to any of those police department picnics? Why you never brought colleagues to my school plays like other parents did?" Vinny remembered. He'd told her he preferred to keep work and family separate, made it sound like a choice born of healthy boundaries rather than fear. "You said it was because reporters had to stay objective," Sarah continued. "But then I started paying attention. Started noticing how you never talked about specific people from work, how you always paid for everything in cash, how we moved apartments twice when I was little, and you never really explained why." The weight of 8 years of careful lies settled on Vinny's chest like a stone. All those times he'd congratulated himself on keeping Sarah innocent, on preserving her childhood from the darkness he chronicled for a living. She'd been watching, calculating, understanding more than he'd ever imagined. "I'm not stupid, Dad." Sarah's voice carried an edge of anger now. "I know what organized crime means. I know those people don't just cooperate with reporters out of civic duty. And I know that joke you made on TV about Gotti's son wasn't just some random comment." "What do you mean?" I mean, you've been building up to something like that for months, getting more reckless, making comments that were meaner than they used to be. Sarah stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the linoleum. Ever since the anniversary. Vinny's blood went cold. What anniversary? Tommy's anniversary, 3 months ago. August 15th. Sarah's eyes were bright with unshed tears, but her voice remained steady. You think I don't remember Uncle Tommy? You think I don't know what day he died? The kitchen fell silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of Mrs. Kowalski's television through the thin walls. Vinny felt something fundamental shifting inside him, like the first crack in a dam that's been holding back floodwaters for too long. You never told me how he really died, Sarah said quietly, but I figured it out when I got older. And I figured out that you blame yourself, and I've been watching you get more and more angry at everything, at the criminals you write about, at the system, at yourself. She walked to the window and looked down at the street. There's a black car parked across from the newsstand. 2 men inside. They were there when I got home from school. Vinny joined her at the window. The Cadillac was still there, patient as a predator. So, Sarah said, not looking at him, what did you do? And don't tell me it was just a joke about some dead kid, because we both know it was more than that. For the first time in 8 years, Vinny looked at his daughter and saw Marie staring back at him, not in the color of her eyes or the shape of her face, but in the unflinching way she demanded truth when everyone else was content with comfortable lies. I don't know, he said finally, but I think I'm about to find out. The words hung between them like a confession that couldn't be taken back. Vinny watched Sarah's reflection in the window, her 17-year-old face showing the kind of resignation that belonged on someone twice her age. We need to leave, he said finally. Tonight. Where? Your Aunt Linda's in Jersey. Maybe further. Vinny was already moving, his mind cataloging what they'd need. Cash. He had maybe $300 in the apartment. Sarah's passport was in his bedroom safe, along with some jewelry of Marie's they could sell if necessary. Pack light. Just essentials. Dad. Sarah's voice stopped him halfway to the bedroom. Look at the car. Vinny turned back to the window. The Cadillac's passenger door was opening. A man in a dark coat stepped onto the sidewalk, casual as someone heading to buy cigarettes. But instead of crossing the street, he lit a cigarette and leaned against the car, his eyes fixed on their building. They're not hiding anymore, Sarah whispered. The phone rang. They both froze, staring at the kitchen wall where the avocado green rotary phone Marie had insisted on keeping hung like an accusation. It rang again, the sound sharp and demanding in the small space. Don't answer it, Sarah said. But Vinny was already moving. After 8 years of chasing stories, of building sources, of trading information like currency, he needed to know what currency he was paying with now. Torino. His voice came out steady, professional. You should have stayed away from the Alberti story. The voice was different this time. Older, tired. Not the smooth menace from the night before, but something harder to pin down. Something that sounded almost familiar. Who is this? You don't remember me. But you destroyed my family 8 years ago. Front page story about a drug operation in Sheepshead Bay. You remember that one, Vincent? Vinny's mind raced through the dozens of stories he'd written, the endless parade of arrests and trials and convictions that had built his reputation. Sheepshead Bay, 8 years ago. The summer after Tommy died, when he'd been working 18-hour days to keep from thinking about his brother's funeral. Alberti, he said slowly. Tony Alberti. Very good. You do remember. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. Tony Alberti, mid-level dealer working for the Lucchese family. Vinny had gotten a tip about a major drug operation, followed the story for weeks, built a case with court documents and police sources and surveillance photos, the kind of methodical journalism that had made his career. You went to prison, Vinny said. 20 to life. Thanks to your reporting, they had everything they needed. Every detail, every connection, every piece of evidence laid out like a goddamn instruction manual for the prosecution. Sarah had moved closer, close enough to hear both sides of the conversation. Her face was pale but determined, and Vinny realized she was memorizing every word. Even now, in the middle of his worst nightmare, he felt a surge of pride at her courage. My son Michael, the voice continued. He was 17 when they sent me away. Same age as your daughter is now. Funny how these things work out. The ice in Vinny's stomach spread outward, numbing his fingers. What happened to Michael? What happens to most kids when their father disappears and their mother has to work 3 jobs to keep the lights on? He made bad choices, got involved with people he shouldn't have gotten involved with, died in Rikers 3 years ago. Someone stuck a shiv between his ribs over a card game. Vinny closed his eyes, seeing Tommy's face again, seeing every story he'd ever written about families destroyed by violence, by drugs, by the endless cycle of crime and punishment that he'd chronicled from a safe distance. "I'm sorry about your son," he said, and meant it. "Are you? Because when you made that joke about Gotti's boy on television, when you laughed about dead children, I realized you're not sorry about anything. You think other people's pain is just material for your next story. That's not true, isn't it? Tell me something, Vincent. When my son died, did you write about that? Did you even know it happened?" Vinny said nothing, because there was nothing to say. He didn't remember Michael Alberti, had never heard the name until this moment. "I've been watching you for 3 years," the voice continued, "waiting for the right moment. And when I saw you on that television show, laughing about a father's grief, I knew it was time." Sarah stepped closer to the phone, close enough that her breath was warm against Vinny's ear. He could feel her trembling, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "Where are you?" The question cut through everything else. Not who or why or what do you want, but where. The question that mattered most. "Hello, Sarah," the voice said gently. "You sound just like your mother." The words hit Vinny like a physical blow. Sarah's face went white, but she didn't step back from the phone. "You knew my mother?" Her voice carried the same steady courage that had gotten Marie through 2 years of chemotherapy, never breaking even when the pain became unbearable. "I knew her, yes. Marie worked at St. Francis Hospital when my Michael was born. She was the nurse who stayed late that night because there were complications, held my wife's hand while the doctors worked." Tony Alberti's voice softened with memory. "Your mother saved my son's life before you were even born." The revelation hung in the kitchen air like smoke. Vinny felt the careful walls he'd built around his family's safety crumbling, revealing connections he'd never seen, debts he'd never calculated. "That's why you know where we live," Sarah said. It wasn't a question. "Your mother gave me this address herself, 8 years ago, the day after your father's story hit the front page." Alberti's voice hardened again. "She came to see me before my sentencing, wanted to apologize for what her husband had done to my family." Vinny grabbed the phone. "That's impossible. Marie never—" "She never told you because she knew you'd try to stop her. Knew you'd make it about your career, your sources, your precious professional ethics." The contempt in Alberti's voice was thick enough to taste. "But she understood something you never did, that the people you write about aren't characters in a story. They're human beings with families who love them." The memory came flooding back unbidden. Marie in those final weeks, insisting on making trips alone, claiming she needed time to think. He'd assumed she was processing her illness, saying goodbye to places that mattered to her. The possibility that she'd been cleaning up his messes, protecting him from consequences he was too self-absorbed to see, had never occurred to him. "She asked me to wait," Alberti continued. "Said Sarah needed her father, even if he was a selfish bastard who'd never learned to see past his own ambition. Made me promise not to hurt you while she was alive." Sarah's hand found Vinny's arm, her fingers digging into his sleeve. "But Mom's been gone for 2 years. 2 years, 3 months, and 16 days. I've been counting." The kitchen felt smaller suddenly, the walls pressing in as Vinny understood the true scope of his blindness, not just about the story that had destroyed Tony Alberti's family, but about his own wife's final months, her desperate attempts to protect him from a reckoning she'd seen coming. "The car outside," Vinny said. "Your people have been watching us." "My people?" Alberti laughed, a sound like broken glass. "You think this is some organized crime operation? Some elaborate mob revenge? Vincent, you still don't understand what you're dealing with. Then explain it to me. I'm a 70-year-old man with emphysema and a social security check that barely covers rent on a studio apartment in Queens. My organization is me and my nephew Paulie, who drives for a living and thinks the internet is a communist plot. The bitterness in Alberti's voice was absolute. The only thing I have left is time and the patience to use it properly. Sarah stepped closer to the phone again. What do you want from us? I want your father to understand what it feels like to lose someone who matters more than your own life. I want him to feel the same helplessness I felt watching my son disappear into a system that chewed him up and spit him out. Alberti paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter. But your mother asked me to be better than that. Vinny felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of guilt he'd carried for so long it had become part of his identity. What do you mean? She said the man she married wasn't evil, just lost. Said he'd been carrying his brother's death like a stone in his chest, and it was making him cruel in ways he didn't recognize. The phone crackled with static. She asked me to help you find your way back to the person you used to be. The revelation hit Vinny like a revelation and an accusation rolled into one. Marie, dying in a hospital bed, negotiating with a man whose life her husband had destroyed, trying to engineer some kind of redemption she wouldn't live to see. So what happens now? Sarah asked. Now your father has a choice to make. He can keep running, keep treating other people's pain like raw material for his career, keep building walls between himself and the consequences of his actions. Alberti's voice grew stronger. Or he can do what your mother believed he was capable of. He can start telling the truth about the damage he's caused. Starting with the story he should have written about my son 3 years ago. Vinny looked at Sarah, seeing Marie's unwavering moral clarity reflected in their daughter's face. Where do you want to meet? He said. The Prospect Park carousel was empty at 11 on a Tuesday night, the painted horses frozen mid-gallop in the darkness beyond the security fence. Vinny and Sarah sat on a bench 50 feet away, watching Tony Alberti emerge from the shadows like a ghost made flesh. He was smaller than Vinny had expected, frailer. The man who'd terrorized him for 3 days turned out to be a bent figure in a worn overcoat, walking with the careful steps of someone whose bones had grown brittle with age and loss. When he settled onto the bench across from them, Vinny could hear the wheeze in his breathing. Thank you for coming, Alberti said simply. They sat in silence for a moment, 3 people connected by threads of damage and grief that stretched back decades. The carousel horses watched with painted eyes, their eternal smiles incongruous against the weight of what had brought them together. Tell me about Michael, Vinny said finally. Alberti pulled out a wallet worn smooth with handling. The photograph he extracted was creased from folding and unfolding, but the image was clear. A teenage boy with his father's eyes and his mother's smile, wearing a Mets jersey too big for his thin frame. He wanted to be a teacher, Alberti said. History. Used to quiz me about World War II while I made breakfast. His voice caught slightly. After I went away, he started running with kids from the neighborhood, dealing, stealing cars, stupid kid stuff that turns serious fast when there's no father around to knock sense into you. Sarah leaned forward, studying the photograph. He looks like he was sweet. He was, right up until the end. Alberti carefully returned the photo to his wallet. Even in Rikers, he called his mother every week, told her he was taking his GED, told her he was staying clean. Maybe it was true, maybe it wasn't. But he was trying to protect her from the truth, just like she was trying to protect him from giving up hope. I could have written about him, Vinny said quietly, when he died. Could have asked questions about what happens to families when the system destroys them. But you didn't. No, I didn't even know his name. Alberti nodded, as if this confirmed something he'd suspected all along. That's what your wife understood, that you'd gotten so caught up in building your career on other people's destruction, you'd stopped seeing them as people. She said the man she married used to care about justice, not just headlines. The wind picked up, rattling the bare branches overhead. Sarah pulled her coat tighter and looked between the 2 men, her expression thoughtful. What happens now? She asked. Now your father writes the story he should have written 3 years ago, Alberti said. About Michael. About what happens to kids when their fathers disappear into the system. About how the families behind your headlines are more than just collateral damage. And if I don't? Alberti's smile was sad rather than threatening. Then you don't. I'm not going to hurt you, Vincent. I'm not going to hurt Sarah. Your wife made me promise, and I keep my promises to the dead. He stood slowly, bones creaking audibly in the cold air. But you'll go on being the same man who laughs about dead children on television. And eventually, that man will destroy what's left of his family all by himself. He walked away without looking back, disappearing into the shadows as quietly as he'd emerged. Vinny and Sarah sat in the silence he left behind, watching the empty carousel turn slowly in the breeze. "Are you going to write it?" Sarah asked finally. Vinny thought about Michael Alberti, 17 years old with dreams of teaching history, thought about Tommy, lost to needles and despair while his older brother chased bylines, thought about Marie, dying in a hospital bed and still trying to save him from himself. "Yeah," he said, "I'm going to write it." 3 months later, the story ran on the front page of the Post, "The Other Victims, When Justice Destroys Families." It won a national magazine award and generated exactly the kind of attention Vinny had spent his career chasing. But for the first time in years, he found he didn't care about the accolades. What mattered was the letter that arrived 2 weeks after publication. No return address, just a few lines written in an old man's careful handwriting. "Thank you for remembering my son. Marie would be proud." Vinny folded the letter carefully and put it in his wallet, next to a photograph of his brother. Some debts, he was learning, could never be fully repaid, but they could be acknowledged, they could be remembered, and sometimes that was enough.